Good evening, everyone. Thanks for attending the Falmouth League of Women Voters monthly public meeting. I'm Sylvia Shulkin, spokesperson for the Falmouth League. It's a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Falmouth League's Board of Directors. We begin all of our public meetings with a reading of the League's mission statement. Many of you watching this program are familiar with the League's mission statement, but it bears repeating, both as an affirmation of our dedication to the principles of democratic governance and as a reminder that democracy is not a spectator sport. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization of women and men that encourages informed, active participation in government. We're nonpartisan because we never support a candidate or a party. We're political because we do take stands on major public policy issues, but only after study, discussion, and forming a consensus. The League works to increase public understanding of major public policy issues and hopes, in any case, to influence policy through education and advocacy. Informed public participation in government can range from casting a ballot in a local election or a federal or state election to running for public office or working for a candidate for that office. Which reminds me, the Falmouth League of Women Voters, in cooperation with FCTV, will hold its candidates night on Wednesday, April 27th, starting at 7 o'clock in the Herman Room at the main library. And that event will also be recorded live and then redistributed up until the election by FCTV. So please bear that in mind. You'll be hearing more about it. Probably you'll think you'll be hearing too much about it, but we hope that you'll come. I want to remind you all to mute yourselves during the presentation. Then you will have an opportunity to ask questions. I'm going to turn the program over now to Eileen Mattingly, who's a member of the Falmouth League's Board of Directors and who was the moving party for this presentation. Go ahead, Eileen.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to introduce Amber. Amber Payne graduated from the University of Virginia with a degree in media studies and began her career at NBC Nightly News as a producer of breaking news and feature stories. While at NBC, she launched NBC Black, a section of the news dedicated to exploring Black identities, social issues, and culture. She's been an executive producer of Teen Vogue, managing editor of BETcomp.com. She has covered stories throughout the United States, Ecuador, parts of West and South Africa, even the funeral of Nelson Mandela. She and her husband, Rainer Ramirez, are also filmmakers. Their two recent documentaries are Harlem Rising, a community changing the odds, and Avenues of Dreams, reclaiming Martin Luther King Boulevards. In 2021, Amber came to Boston as a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, a top honor for exceptional journalists, where she studied how to empower marginalized communities to share their stories. Now she has another opportunity to do just this as co-editor of the Boston Globe's new initiative, The Emancipator. And tonight she will tell us about this new adventure and why it's so important. Amber will answer questions at the end of her presentation. Please put your questions into the chat box as they arise. And please, as Sylvia said, be sure to mute yourself while the speaker is presenting. League member Mary Fran Buckley will be monitoring the chat room and she will collate and relay the questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you again for coming, and Amber, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Eileen. It's new to call you Eileen. You were my high school English teacher and yearbook advisor. And so it's just been wonderful to keep in touch with you all these years. You haven't changed. That is a compliment. You look the same as when I graduated 22 years ago. So it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. And, I want to tell you about the Emancipator and also talk about inclusive storytelling. I think that is something that, even with the work and the mission that you all believe in and do, it's something I think that I hope you can take something away from in your day-to-day interactions and your work with others and your mission. But what is the Emancipator? The Emancipator is a digital publication that will reimagine the first abolitionist newspaper in the United States. It's a collaboration between the Boston Globe opinion team and Boston University's Center for Antiracist Research, which is directed by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, who many came to know a bit more of with his fairly recent bestseller, How to Be Antiracist. And that phrase and that conversation really picked up. So, I want to I'll tell you a little bit about the Emancipator, but I do want to get into a little bit of my journey to this place of leading and building the Emancipator and really what brought me there. But I will say, just as those 19th century anti-slavery publications were created to reframe the conversation and amplify the quest for abolition, the new Emancipator will center critical voices, debates, and evidence-based opinion to reframe the national conversation on racial equity, and not just have a conversation for the sake of conversation, but to bring about change, to bring about racially just outcomes and solutions. And so the platform is really being created to provoke new conversations on progress on racial justice and using big ideas driven by data, scholarship, and commentary. There's so much scholarship that it doesn't make its way into a nice little New York Times op-ed, or it doesn't become a #1 best-selling book. There's a lot of work being done on education, health equity, that really needs to be brought to light. So I'm really excited as the co-editor-in-chief, which is a unique model, but I share that title with my colleague, Deborah Douglas. And we are building toward a late April launch, mid to late April launch. So that's exciting. And I'll be sharing a little bit more about what we've been up to. But first, I do want to share my presentation with you about revolutionary storytelling. So bear with me as I share screen. Okay. Eileen will let me know if that is not coming through. Revolutionary storytelling, empowering communities to share their stories. This really became important to me. I spent my year away from journalism, really thinking about storytelling, really reflecting on the work that I did, as a producer at NBC Nightly News, where I had the challenge of telling a complex story in 2 minutes or less. Really thinking about the things that get missed. In some ways, the medium really can limit or amplify the message. So I did a lot of thinking about that too. What kind of mediums could be most beneficial? But inclusive storytelling has the power to change attitudes and perspectives, and the impact of technology, social media, and different platforms can really make a difference. But you can harness the power of that medium to tell your story effectively and to a broader audience. So we'll look at a couple case studies. I'll share some of my own work and some things I've learned along the way. I wonder if you've seen this photo. This is an image from a story a couple years ago about climate activists. And there's a well-known Swedish teen activist, Greta Thunberg. Last January, an AP photographer from the World Economic Forum in Davos was covering the youth climate workshops, and they took a picture of 5 activists. 1, 2, 3, 4. So where's the 5th young woman? Well, in prepping to send the image to the AP photo wire, a service used by outlets around the world, the photographer cropped one person out. The initial explanation for the cropping was that It enabled a close-up of Thunberg, who's the star, and it removed a distracting building behind this young woman. But when the activists recognized the photo and that she'd been erased from it, this led to a very viral moment that hit deep. And we often hear about Greta and activists who look like her, but who is this woman and what is her story? Well, her name is Vanessa Nakati, and she tweeted, "You didn't just erase a photo, you erased a continent." So this is Vanessa. She's a climate activist from Uganda. And in January 2018, after educating herself about the seriousness of environmental issues facing her community, she began staging climate strikes every Friday to raise awareness. And her efforts were noticed by researchers and scientists. And she was invited to join a workshop with these other activists in Davos. So the AP executive editor apologized, saying, "We train our journalists to be sensitive to issues of inclusion and omission," but they failed to mention her name, which she pointed out on Twitter. And last January, she reflected on this moment, saying that, the cropping made it possible to believe that African climate activists were absent from Davos and that there wasn't a global youth climate movement that included people like me and many others in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So I share this because Vanessa's story really encapsulates the kind of erasure in media that has been happening for hundreds of years, and the pain that it causes, the damage and disservice it does to journalism at large. As journalists, we want to tell a complete story. We want to give our viewers and our readers the full picture. So what does it mean to be inclusive? And I use inclusive instead of diverse, and diversity, I think it's a little bit overused. When we tell inclusive stories, we have the power to change perspectives and to educate. So whether that's a piece of long reported investigative journalism that changes hearts and laws, or a feel-good story that inspires you to make a difference in your community. As journalists, as whether we're reporters, producers, editors, we have this power to shape a narrative, and that can be revolutionary. And that's a privilege that we can't take lightly. There's been a lot of newsroom reckoning in the last couple of years. Newsrooms conducting audits of their race coverage in an effort to account for their pasts and to rethink their futures. And of course, we saw this in the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. Newsrooms really realizing, looking around and saying, who's in our newsroom? Who can we have authentically speak up to and cover these stories? I want to share this from this group, Color of Change, about narratives. And as you can see, it says, Black families represent 59% of stories about poverty in news and opinion outlets like CNN and Fox News, even though they make up just 27% of poor families in the country. So there's a distortion that happens, and these distorted narratives become weaponized narratives, and they promote Black inferiority. They can impact perception and policy. And bias can present itself in everything from beats to headlines, cut lines, sources, and photo editings. And it's blind spots like these that can cause...
Just say dial in. You want me to do it for you?
And I just want to remind everyone to please mute. But these blind spots can cause us to miss the full picture and the full understanding. A couple examples of this over the years. I think it was last year, the year before, the Kansas City Star dug into its archives to compare their coverage to that of the Black press. And they found decades of negative portrayals of Black Kansas Cityans that played into stereotypes and played a role in keeping the city divided. And so much was missing. Aspirations and milestones of an entire population were overlooked, rendering them invisible. Native son Charlie Bird Parker didn't get a significant headline in the Star until he died. And even then, his name was misspelled and his age was wrong. So, they ended up making an apology in that coverage. Last year, the Boston Globe actually announced that a program that will allow people to ask the newspaper to update and anonymize past coverage of them online. It's called the Fresh Start Initiative, and it's part of a broader effort of rethinking how they cover criminal justice and thinking about how it affects these communities of color. So they announced it to say, Globe journalism was never meant to be a permanent obstacle to someone's success, with the worst decisions and moments in regular people's lives accessible by a few keystrokes for the rest of time. We are not in the business of rewriting the past, but we want to update the record and not stand in the way of a regular person's ability to craft their future. So a lot of newsrooms are thinking about the lasting impact that these stories can have on their communities, on people, because they're finding that they need to rebuild trust with those communities. The Philly Inquirer is another example. They ran this story about the city's infrastructure after in the aftermath of the uprisings after George Floyd. And the headline, "Buildings Matter Too," essentially equating the damage to buildings caused by looting during the protests to the loss of Black Americans killed by police. And all of this against a backdrop of the city where 1 out of 3 residents is white. Its major suburbs are about 2/3 white. So after this headline, there was a whole reckoning at the Inquirer. Journalists of color called out sick and tired and wrote a letter to management. They issued an apology. There were resignations, but it started a larger audit and conversation about equity and inclusion in the newsroom. And about 13% of the staff was Black at the time. In this audit, this is a quote from this audit where someone said, when you don't have enough people or have enough beats, you tend to do what you know. And, that's what we do, right? That's what we usually do. And there's kind of a status quo that gets passed down. In this conversation in this audit that Temple University held, they talked to a lot of journalists in the newsroom who said that there were assumptions about the imagined reader's whiteness that forced them to alter their stories, adjust their style and their framing, or not do a story at all. Inclusive story ideas and pitches. Well, my career at NBC Nightly News, these are just some photos and highlights. As I was introduced, I've been able to cover stories around the world. It's been such a privilege, and from the Olympics to Mandela's funeral, here I am at the 70th anniversary of Normandy. And in the time that I had to think about journalism and be out of the newsroom, I was thinking about how I did fall into some of those paths that those Inquirer journalists were saying, thinking about pitching what the editors and the executive producers wanted to see, and not always pitching what I thought might be the best story or a great story for the community. Possibly that was because at times, those stories are hard to get picked up, and you do get tired of putting your hand up and pitching and fighting for a story, only to have something else replace it at the last minute. I really became committed, though, kind of towards maybe the midpoint of my time at Nightly News, to telling marginalized stories. I had an experience in the newsroom where my executive producer called on me one day, Amber, what do you think of this story? And it happened to be a story about, I think, a Black celebrity. I didn't really have much of an opinion on it. I was a little bit annoyed that I was called on because I was the only Black producer in the room, and that there weren't very many of us on staff, even, around the bureaus. And I later reflected on that and took that as more of a mission and a challenge that, I needed to be ready to speak up and advocate or dissuade from a story about my community. And I really embraced it from there on. After I was at NBC Nightly News for 10 years, working my way up from lowly researcher, production assistant to a producer, traveling the world, working with the anchors. And I was given the opportunity to launch NBC Black for NBCnews.com. And I really had full editorial control and range. And I got to do stories that I would have never been able to do as, a minute 50 stories for the evening news. Or at least, that would have been more challenging to get on in the depth that I wanted to present them. So from stories about environmental justice, the story of this landfill in Alabama, to something you don't really get to talk or learn about. You think about the cannabis industry. It's very white, but in Colorado, there are some African-American entrepreneurs, as they call themselves, and doing stories about Black women and the importance of their vote, and transgender couples. So I really do feel proud of the work that I was able to do in leading that platform for 3 years. But I left to go to Teen Vogue. And at Teen Vogue, we really made a conscious effort to be inclusive in our coverage. These are the cover images. Of course, it's all digital. There's no magazine anymore, of our coverage after the Parkland shooting. And, Parkland, it was a predominantly white school. The ones speaking out were mostly white students, not all. But when we did our coverage for Teen Vogue, we wanted to invite gun violence survivors and activists from all different walks of life, because there are a lot of kids in Black and brown communities experiencing violence, and it's not covered. So we did have students from Ferguson and a young woman from Wyoming. And we also had a young woman whose brother was killed in the Newtown shooting. So we were able to really make that story a little broader and bring in different voices. Let's see, I'm gonna skip past that one. Who should tell their story? What if I'm not part of this community that I'm covering? That's a question that a journalist, everyone asks themselves. And the ways that I've thought about it is doing your research, learn about that community, do your own searching, reading, or finding people who are willing to talk to you. Can I tap into knowledge from a friend or someone from my team? And listening, asking questions. Don't pretend to be the expert, and empower others to tell their story and not make assumptions about their story. I had this up as an example from the Washington Post of, they did a very deep dive, a complex dive with their George Floyd's America coverage. And I think they were able to ask some of these guiding questions about focusing on different experiences and thinking about who benefits from certain social structures, who is marginalized. So using those as some guiding points. This is an example of, I was also leading a vertical called Them, an LGBTQ digital part of Condé Nast while I was overseeing Teen Vogue. And in this video, I, as the executive producer, but not a member of the community, had empowered my team to, while I was helping with overseeing, I really had empowered my team to handle the interviews, handle the editing, and level up to me for questions and editorial feedback and story structure, but really strived to respect the team and their desire to tell this story. So we'll just go past that too. I will play a bit of this one as just an example of a video that we did where you may think of a certain group or archetype of people and assume something about them, but we wanted to show the variety and the different of undocumented girls. And we had a series called Ask a Girl, ask a ... ask an undocumented girl, ask a Muslim girl. So let me show you a little bit of this one.
When I was in high school, there was this program and you had to write an article of why you were an American. And one of the girls in my school found out I was applying and she was like, but you're not American, you weren't born here, so you shouldn't be able to apply. And I remember I got so angry because it was like the first time anyone had like questioned if I was an American. And I had never thought of it like that. So I wrote the article about how being an American is your values of diversity, of tolerance, inclusivity, freedom, rights to an education, and all of those values are values that I have and values that my family has. I'm Bruna. I'm 26 years old. I was born in Brazil and I grew up in Florida.
My name is Marcy. I am 22 years old. I am from Honduras.
I'm Wella. I'm from Zambia. I'm 21. Grew up in Maryland.
My name is Zulema. I'm 23 from Mexico, but I was raised here.
I'm Esther. I'm 21 years old, a Korean American born in Brazil.
My name is Yatsiri. I came at the age of 2 from Mexico, and I am an undocumented person living in the US.
So that was a great opportunity to share so many different young women's story. And we did a series of those videos. I want to talk about counter narratives. And while I was at BET, we did a story about Black surfers who were hosting a paddle out for George Floyd. So Black surfers, not something you always see or hear about. And in this story, we spoke to a woman and her son who happened to have autism. And it was not a box check casting choice. Let's have somebody with this who's, differently abled in our piece. But it happened to be a part of the story where the mom talked about fears of having her son with autism approached by police, that his demeanor could be misconstrued by law enforcement. And a very high percentage of those killed by police do have disabilities. I don't have the number handy, but we were just talking to a woman who's launching a network for disabled journalists. And she was talking to us about that story. So I think, this was an opportunity to do something a little different than just your typical protest video. And that's why I call it a counter narrative. It's kind of counter to what you might expect to do a protest story about surfers paddling out on the water in protest. Some things that I've tried to look at as I look for sources, and I think it's just kind of also relatable, elevating real life experiences and authoritative voices. You're the expert of your life, not always. While we as journalists, we find the expert, we go to the scholar, we go to the expert, having real people give their experience, they are experts. And that's certainly something we are going to be incorporating with the Emancipator. Avoiding box checking. People know when you're just box checking, I need to find a woman for this story. I need to find a person of color for this story. And coastal bias, being that media is so heavy on the coasts, finding people who are in New York and DC and LA and just trying to get out of the usual places. Avoiding tokenizing, being transparent with people about the interview process. I always would tell people, I'm going to talk to you for a long time, but we are going to take the best, 20 seconds or 30 seconds. So having that openness with people is something I've learned from. Unique mediums and platforms. I did produce with my husband this documentary, Harlem Rising. And in it, we were able to empower others to tell their story by including archival footage that was filmed by Black and Brown youth dating back to the 80s and 90s. And these were the very youth that were vilified by the media in the 90s, called super predators in New York. we wanted to show the counter narrative there, let the community speak for themselves about they pulled out of a difficult period and struggle. So that's in the documentary medium, there's no narrator. It was really the community speaking about the work that they did. And that was very exciting to be able to do that. And I'll show you the trailer.
I describe Harlem as a family. It's really like community.
When I think about Harlem, I think about the phoenix that rose from the ashes. From those abandoned buildings, that broken place came hip-hop, fashion, all that came from that struggle.
Harlem was the place that when people thought about the future of Black people, they thought it was going to happen in Harlem. But then something happened, something that interrupted this great cultural conglomeration. It started with poverty and it ended with drugs.
What do we want? When do we want it?
I think it's time for some of us to stand up and rebuild America community by community.
The ultimate goal of the Harlem Children's Zone is to end generational poverty.
This is our promise, this is our creed.
I said, that's what changes her. When the kids really believe that they're going to college, that they're special, that people believe, I said, this thing is gonna work.
And I think that also speaks to the concept of asset framing. And asset framing is a narrative model that defines people by their assets and aspirations before noting their challenges and deficits. And, there are certain stereotypes that come to people's minds about a community, about a people, about an era. And I think that was also our effort with that film, to use the asset framing instead of deficit framing, defining people by their challenges. The digital divide is real and something we need to contend with. And, this was just an example of Texas news outlets messaging about the power outages in Texas last year. There were severe power outages, and they were able to reach hard to reach communities. And kind of this text message news is, well, I don't know if I would call it something newer, but it's probably becoming a little more popular. People are experimenting a little bit more with it. It's something that we are thinking about how we might deploy, with the Emancipator. This is just a note about kind of examining, and something, as you are all consumers of the news and media, and maybe it's kind of questions that as you notice and as you read, looking at things and asking, is race relevant here? Have they contextualized a sensitive story properly on social media? Look at a newspaper, a section front, a homepage. Does it feature a range of stories and visuals? Or is it the same kind of people? Are we always reading about the same neighborhoods? Does the story rely on a police narrative or another institution? And have, we flipped things? Have we questioned the police on how they know what they're asserting? I think there's been a change in reporting. I know when I was overseeing NBC Black, and there was a series of police killings of Black men, and we couldn't publish until we had the police report. We didn't have to wait until we had a family member or somebody else. That's changing, and that's a good thing, to really be able to not rely on that single narrative. That has been part of the problem. And if you don't build it, see it. If you don't see it, build it. There are a lot of new startups in the last few years. The 19th is a great publication focusing on women and gender and politics. URL Media is a conglomerate that is amplifying, a series of other smaller sites that focus on different communities: the Haitian community, the Muslim community, Latino community, and Scalawag is a nonprofit focused on the American South and realigned to focus on the experiences of people of color. So, and I should have typed in the Emancipator to this. We are a news startup also filling the void, where we're filling the void, providing context, history, a through line. So what about Vanessa? We started with Vanessa. Last fall, this 24-year-old activist released her first book, reclaiming her narrative about her road to empowerment and how others can follow her lead. And so it's part memoir, part manifesto about the intersection of climate change and racial justice and social justice. So just an example of, if it's taking control of your narrative. And it's pretty cool that she got to do that. And, I encourage you all to build a culture of accountability internally and externally. This is a quote from the report. Pushing for an anti-racist newsroom means putting policies in place of traditions, engagement in place of norms of distanced objectivity, and difficult conversations in place of colorblind politeness. And doing this work requires structures to make talking openly about race not just okay, but required and incentivized. And it requires a shift from whiteness as the default. It requires openly grappling with the legacy of structural racism as the default. So powerful words, and certainly something that I've been thinking about a lot with the Emancipator. And I do want to tell you a little more about the Emancipator now. And I do encourage you, I think you can put your questions in the chat. You don't have to wait for that. So feel free to put your questions in, because I'm coming to the end of my presentation here too. So as I said, the Emancipator, we are reframing this conversation on racial justice and equity. It is this partnership. And currently, we plan to launch mid to late April with a series about the racial wealth gap. We have a newsletter called Unbound, and I invite you to sign up for it for updates. I'll put that link in the chat. We are on social media as well. You can follow us. I'll put that in the chat. And I'll show you, a little bit of what we've been up to. In January, we see ourselves as a digital magazine, and we are very eager to get into the conversation with everyone. We're very eager to weigh in on that. And I think it was the history of how the Emancipator did come to be, that this new Emancipator, was that in the summer of 2020, there was a conversation between the editor of the opinion pages, Bina Venkatraman, and Dr. Ibram Kendi during Juneteenth. And there was such a reaction to that conversation. It was kind of necessary dialogue. And the two organizations really thought, we're both in Boston. The Globe is a powerful platform. The research that the Center for Anti-Racist Research is doing is so in-depth and so important. They have departments, again, from scholars focusing on issues of health equity to tech, tech and bias, algorithms and bias, education. So really, how do we harness kind of those topics and harness the journalism of the Globe and create something new? And the decision was, we're going to create something new here. Instead of just doing a newsletter, instead of just doing events, we are going to launch a publication that is dedicated to these issues. So that's really where things began. on January 6th, we'll be doing video commentary, and I'll play just the first minute of what we published for January 6th. That anniversary was an anniversary we wanted to have, that felt like the Emancipator needs to weigh in on this anniversary and have something to say. So we did publish a few pieces and a couple commentaries, and I'll just play the first minute of Dr. Kendi's.
When I came of age in the 90s, there was a running joke in Black communities. It was one of those bitter jokes that keep you laughing to stop from crying. Kind of like how Black Twitter named the new variant, Omarion. The bitter joke I'm talking about is how white people can easily steal when Black people are around. That when Black people come into the store, the clerks and their eyes and their suspicions follow us, allowing white people to go undetected and rob the store blind. Black people would joke about how in racially profiling us, the store, like the nation, ends up being exposed and harmed too. The joke carried so much meaning, so much rage, so much history. And I'm reminded of this joke as I reflect on the latest time when white supremacists nearly stole an election by claiming Black and brown voters had stolen it. And now, a year after the Capitol insurrection, as the stealing of an election transfigured into robbing state by state what's left of the storehouse of democracy.
Stand aside and let us in, you traitors!
Some people are wondering, where's the 5 alarms? Why isn't this a national emergency? Why isn't America incensed and infuriated? There are many reasons. One is because the main perpetrators are white.
So this is a video commentary, and we will be doing a lot of different video commentary. This is, one perspective and one viewpoint. And I just show it to give you, a sense of something we've been working on. I think part of our goal too is talking about the history. We have a comic, an artist who has a comic called Everything's Racist: The Difficult History Behind Everything. Really looking at things that seem innocuous or seem like it really blends in, and decoding, deconstructing, and providing the context. So he has a number of ideas about things he's going to cover. Apparently, the Ice Cream Man song, white gloves and cartoons. There are a number of topics that he is going to tackle. So we will be doing political cartoons, opinion, commentary, as well as more narrative journalism. So those are just a few of the things that we have been up to. I'm going to stop sharing screen here. And I know that there have been some questions popping into the chat. I think, let's see, what else would I like to share with you before we get to those? Our audience, I would say our audience is, there are people who are looking for resources. I think one thing we were really conscious of is, in that summer of 2020, there's also not just the uprisings, but in the pandemic, there were a lot of people coming to terms or to reality with the disproportionate nature of that, and looking at health equity in different communities and opportunities, and where your zip code can determine your zip code, where you grew up, can determine your life's outcome. So there were a lot of people convicted after that summer who wanted to learn more, wanted to do more. I mean, that's certainly a target audience of ours. We want to bring along anyone who wants to be brought along with us. And we know that there will be some who, are not interested. And I think we are really focused on those who want to do more, want to learn more, want to share. So that is, one note about audience that a lot of people ask about. My own father is very conservative. I know that I can't change his mind about many things, but I do know that he likes to read. He likes to have discussion. And, you know, I want the Emancipator to be an accessible platform for him to learn and to read and to understand some of these complex topics. So that's a bit of what we've been up to in building the Emancipator. And I'm happy to go to questions to answer more and feel what I missed.
Yeah. Okay, Amber. Yeah, we had some questions coming in. And one of the first was, what kind of structures could facilitate open conversations between people of different races?
Let's see. Well, that's a good question. What kind of structures could facilitate open conversation? I don't know if that, you know, it could be structures. I mean, I guess when I think of structures, I think of convenings, I think of events, I think of conversations. I will say that that's something we are focused on with the Emancipator, and it's going to be a bit of an experiment in how that goes and finding out what works. You know, the three pillars of the platform are the editorial, so the kind of the website experience, traditional, you know, you read a story, you might share a story, social media, as in a social first application where we're creating for social. We're not just using it to promote stories or put links out, but we're really trying to have a two-way conversation with people, and events. So that is going to start out virtually. And we do hope to have in-person events in Boston and beyond. And I think, you know, some of it is the storytelling. I'm thinking right now about a story of descendants of a plantation who, Black and white, they have reunions every year and they come together. And, you know, that is really powerful. And sometimes I do hope that those kinds of stories may inspire others to have those conversations. I mean, I think, you know, educating yourself and becoming comfortable with having that conversation with a neighbor or a coworker could be a start, but I think it is about reading and processing and educating.
Yeah.
Good question.
A good one. Yes. Another one is, what evidence can the layperson see to convince them that media outlets care about how minorities, specifically people of African descent, are represented?
Well, I think it can be very clear.
Yeah.
And it can be very, you know, when it comes to the kinds of headlines or the kinds of photos that are chosen, the lack of representation, it sends a clear signal to a community. And I do get asked, even by other journalists, just about the Boston Globe and their reputation with the Black community. And how is that repaired? And is that, you know, how do we navigate that as the Emancipator, as being kind of, you know, directly affiliated with the Globe? And I think the community, it's all in the coverage. And from what I have seen at the Globe, is that there's, while I have been there, there have been some really, really good stories that told by Black and Brown reporters who have had to rebuild trust in communities. They've had to go and rebuild the trust and tell an authentic story of the community. I think it goes back to the asset framing and not the deficit framing, and the choices that an editor makes about a headline or the first line of a story. And we're still going to see problematic storytelling. it's not going to change overnight. But I think that any person has the right to speak up and raise a flag and call that out and I've had people, reach out to me about things that were problematic that I was educating myself on. So I say it's speak up and raise the flag.
Do you think the Emancipator will have a real effect on the globe and maybe change how the globe does it? Or do you see it as a singular entity? Not one that would replace the globe, meld into the globe, but the influence that the Emancipator will have on how the globe in the future is delivered to us.
I mean, I certainly hope so. I certainly hope so. We will be our own entity. We are a microsite of the globe. But for example, the first series we're launching with is about the wealth gap and really focused on the Black wealth gap, examining access to credit, student debt loans, retirement in a series of pieces that really examines the issue, but solutions. And that's going to be co-published in the Globe. So we are putting it out online, and it's also going to be published on the Globe site, on the hard copy, in a rollout strategy that, I think it's maybe Mondays. There are 4 pieces, and I think 4 Mondays, our pieces, the Emancipator pieces, will be part of the Globe. So that's part of the strategy that we are, essentially syndicating with the Globe and potentially with other partners. There are other partners, news partners that we've spoken to about whether they want to cross-publish some of the stories that we're going to do. So I think it can be, of course, we hope that we can influence and also embed ourselves in the Globe's coverage, still identifying, ourselves clearly as the Emancipator.
Amen. Have you seen other newspapers around the country doing something similar to this?
Well, I talked a lot about the Philly Inquirer, and they currently have a project called A More Perfect Union, where they are taking a very deep dive on their history and the issues. They've kind of been, it's kind of a 1-year project. I do see a lot of other newspapers. The Maryland Independent issued an apology for coverage, racist, horrible coverage of old, and they cited specific examples. So I'm seeing a lot of apologies from newspapers. I think it's, it remains to be seen as to whether change happens, and change happens when when leadership changes too. And, not everybody at the top can look the same. And having experienced that and coming up in a newsroom, looking around for someone who looked like me, it was very rare. I think it is changing now. It is, I can speak a lot to the TV side because that's what I came up in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question in the chat is from somebody saying, we read the Boston Globe daily and notice that the obituaries never have a photo of a Black or even a brown face. Literally, one Black face appeared 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was a nun. Is this cultural about the Boston community or systemic?
Well, I can't speak to the Globe and the obituaries. That's surprising to me and disappointing.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I can't speak to it.
Another person is saying, comment on who should tell the story. Cultural responsiveness, while used in education circles, is certainly applicable to this question. If there is no representation, then whomever draws the short straw, as it were, should indeed do their due diligence so that representation is as accurate as it could be.
Yeah, who should tell the story?
Yeah.
I think that there are, this is a question we got recently just because we're working with a lot of freelancers, and a freelancer asked, Do I need to be of that community to pitch that story, to tell that story? And my answer to them was, it depends on the story. If we're working on a story about, or finding a writer for a story about the criminal, about the Massachusetts probation system. And the most important thing to me on that story is finding someone who really knows the topic and who has experience reporting on the criminal legal system. And the race, the ethnicity of that person is not the top qualifier for that. If you are telling a story and are not from that community, I think it goes to a little bit of what I touched on in the presentation, and making sure you have that balance or those touch points to make sure you have the story, and that you're getting to the cultural sensitivities. Some newsrooms, they don't have enough people. They don't have the people yet. And I think that shouldn't prevent them from covering a community, but it does make it a little more complex. It does mean they have more work to do. They have more homework to do.
Yeah. Another question is from someone saying, as a former social studies teacher, I am horrified at the limitations being put on teachers so that they will fear to teach the truth about Black history. Will the Emancipator be commenting on this or fighting back?
Every day, I feel like there's a new story and restriction and, piece of legislation. And we're very much looking at the parental rights movement as a whole and what that is looking like. And we're so eager to do those stories. We launched in about a month, and for now we've been keeping track of teachers who may have lost their jobs, and we're keeping track of the story so that we can find the right way to cover it, advance it. You see all the same parents speaking up, and those are the stories that are getting told. What about the other parents? There's kind of a default as to who the parents who are upset about things. So we have a lot of ideas. We are open to more. It is definitely an important story to us.
Right. And I think along that same line, there's a trend in some areas of the country, I can't speak to it in Massachusetts, that school boards, there's a activist element of people getting onto school boards, school committees, and other local organizations, so that they do have a very heavy say in what is going on in their community. And that would be another target, I think, too.
That's a good
idea. Yeah.
That's a good idea. Yes. The school, that's another good angle that broadens it.
Yeah. Okay. Another is inclusive conversations where individuals are free to share their stories. Just having a meeting with the only agenda being to share and lean into discomfort together. What are look-fors once you have a story? What does the homework and research process look like? So they kind of two different questions from one person.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate that point though about sharing your stories. I think that speaks to someone else's question about, how do you bring people together? How do you have a meeting, and how do you get people to lean into that discomfort and share that together? Making people feel like they're not going to be attacked for sharing their opinion or asking a question that they're afraid is a stupid question. I think those are necessary, absolutely necessary. So thank you for that. So what are the look-fors once you have a story? The homework. Well, I'm going to go back to the Massachusetts probation story. We connected with this incredible scholar who gave us a number of ideas and said, that's a solution story. So, again, we're not just focused on these are the problems, let's tell you about them. There's actually a story of how they totally flipped things. And there was corruption and disruption maybe it was a decade ago. You all probably know, as I am new here to the state and to the city. And now they have a solution story. So I think we held a meeting, we had a conversation with the commissioner of that office. We heard from him about who can we talk to? Can we talk to the people on your staff? Can we talk to someone, in the system, and talk to families impacted, and kind of getting outside the usual folks that might be approached. And, there's a process called solutions journalism. It's a practice, which I am new to, but my colleague, Deborah, specializes in and has taught courses in. And I think we're also looking at, are these stories that have a solution? And maybe they don't have a solution, but are there people who have ideas for the solution? Is there a way to, again, we were talking about bringing people together. I've envisioned, at some point having some kind of hackathon where you do have people, perhaps at levels of government, and all the way over to, the activist, the organizer, the person in the community, coming together to talk about a solution. So we do that. And yeah, there's a lot of homework and research. We've been meeting with different community groups, different scholars, asking them what we're missing, or what's missing. We're trying to bring about a new platform that advances the discussion. It's not the same thing that you always get. And so I appreciate, being with this audience, and I'll share my contact info as well if anyone has any suggestions or thoughts on that, because I think, we are rooted in history and scholarship, we're rooted in the stories of real people. We'll be doing culture stories. There is an artist that just gave us an idea of something she wants to write about. We've been talking to a woman who's starting a disability journalism network, and she talked to us about a number of ideas that haven't been focused on. And also, we are not just, this is not a Black publication. This is not a black and white discussion. I mean, there's, when it comes to anti-Asian hate, anti-Native Native issues, those are issues that we're going to cover as well. Different ethnicities, communities. There's an anniversary of the killing of Vincent Chin, who was killed in Detroit, kind of in the heat of the auto workers strikes, and he was a victim of this hate crime. And the 40th anniversary is this summer, and that's a story that I am looking for Chinese American journalists to reflect on and cover in a way that they know is important. So kind of speaking to the idea of, who tells what story. But this person also pitched an essay that a multiracial person wanted to tell about how that moment impacted them and their work and their activism. So there are a lot of intersections, and I definitely wanted to make that point and make that clear that, this is through this, the Emancipator is coming from this abolitionist tradition and through the lens of Black struggle and the civil rights struggle, but there are a lot of intersections that get left out of that conversation.
Oh, that's terrific. Our final comment is, thank you so much, Amber. How can we help the great work of the Emancipator? And our question is, how do you access the Emancipator? Is it through the Boston Globe subscription, or is it a separate?
Good question. Nope. I'm going to just put hopefully that goes for you. If not, there's that site too. This takes you to our page, to our landing page. And this will not be behind the paywall. There's no subscription, there's no fee. Anyone can access and read the Emancipator and share it. So I would say please, sign up for our newsletter. Feel free to stay in touch. And once we are out, I hope that you'll share our work and tell others about it. And we're looking to, serve the community. This is of Boston, but not just for Boston. We are we are going to be covering national issues, but Boston is, really a microcosm for a lot of national issues and conversations. So, there is a place where you can write us, the contact page, you can send pitches, and stay in touch. And thank you for having me, and thank you for your support.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Okay, Eileen, it's yours, I think.
Okay, well, I want to thank Amber so much for taking the time to talk with us at what has to be an extraordinarily busy time of your career. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming to the League event this evening. I hope it's given you a lot to think about as we confront a society looking for ways to deal with our divisions and move toward true diversity, equity, and inclusion. And a happy St. Patrick's Day to you all.
That's right. Thanks so much. And thanks to FCTV for filming it and making it available on their website as well.
All right. Thank you all.
Thanks.